Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to be with us. This is John Elcesser. I'm Executive Director of the Indiana Non-Public Education Association, and this is our annual legislative engagement training. And a little belated Thanksgiving to everyone. Hopefully everyone had a great holiday. And that's a good segue into we have a lot to be thankful for here in the state of Indiana from an education perspective in our non-public school world. And what we're going to be talking about today is all those things that we are to be thankful for and how do we protect them and how do we work together to ensure legislatively that things that happen at the State House will hopefully benefit our students and our schools and not be a detriment. For those of you who have not participated in one of our webinars before, we do use the Zoom function. Currently, all of you are muted, and we'd ask you to make sure you don't unmute your phone. It just helps by cutting back on any background noise. You do have a chat function available to you, so if you have questions or comments, we encourage you to use that. I'm with Heidi Harmon here from IMPEA, and she's going to be monitoring that chat function. So when you do chat, we'd encourage you to chat to everyone because she'll be able to kind of follow it more closely than I will. I do want to give you one little disclaimer. I am fighting a cold, hopefully on the far end of the cold, but I'm still dealing with a cough. So I apologize in advance if you have to do that. I've got cough drops ready and water, so hopefully I'll get through this without dealing a whole lot with that cough. So just let me apologize. You know, just in a couple weeks, the 2020 legislative session will start. And it is so important that we are engaged and tuned into that. Many of you on the call, as I look down the names, I would consider veterans. You've probably been a part of this training before. So you'll hear some information that's similar, but you'll also hear things coming out of the last legislative session and what we're looking for going into the 2020 session as well. But on January 6th, all of the legislators from around the state will descend on the State House. And my life will get a lot busier spending time down on Washington Avenue at the State House. And hopefully you all will be engaged in that as well, whether that be in your local area or even coming down periodically to visit. If there's anybody new who's not been a part of this training before, we welcome you. We'll be talking a little bit specifically about the role of legislative liaisons in case that's what your responsibilities are at the school. And you can see on that slide, this kind of the theme of the presentation, and really, I guess it's IMPEA's theme song, and that's we're stronger together. You know, stronger than an individual school, stronger than an individual group of schools. For those of you that are new, if you're not familiar with IMPEA, just very, very quickly, IMPEA has been around since 1974. 12 non-public school leaders came together and decided there were a lot of things that they could do better together than as an individual school or even as a group of schools, like a diocese, a Lutheran district, a Seventh-day Adventist conference. And from that was birthed our common day IMPEA, the Indiana Non-Public Education Association, which now serves 12 different jurisdictions, different groups of schools, and about 420 member schools across the state of Indiana. And we do that by the two arms of our organization. We have an advocacy side, and that's what we'll be talking predominantly about today. We advocate on your behalf at the General Assembly with the Department of Education and with the State Board of Education. And we also have a professional development arm and consultation arm of the group where we do our conferences like IMPACT and IMPEC, and I'll talk just briefly about that a little bit later, and do a lot of phone consultation and meetings to help folks kind of navigate, in particular, our relationship with the state of Indiana. If you're not familiar with the organization CAPE, the Council for American Private Education, it really is our national group which brings together all of the different non-public school groups around the country at the national level. So the president of NCEA, the president of the National LCMS, Lutheran District, serves on that board. The president of Seventh-day Adventist, Friends schools, Jewish schools, Islamic schools. And they do pretty much at the federal level what we do at the state level. And as you can see by the map in front of you, there are currently 39 states that have a state CAPE affiliate. That's what we are here at IMPEA. They look different across the state. They focus sometimes in different ways across the state. Some are staffed, some aren't. But their role is the same as our role, and that is to help ensure the quality and the viability of non-public schools across the country. You know, when we talk about public policy, there's always a question of why do non-public schools have to deal with that? I think that's probably a question that's easy to answer today, especially here in Indiana with everything that goes on between the non-public sector and the public sector. In Indiana in particular, for a long time, we've had state accreditation available to us, which helped forge that kind of codependent relationship between the public sector and the non-public sector, but we also have are blessed to have the choice programs that we have access to here in Indiana as well, which also points to the importance of we in the non-public school community engaging in public policy. It does help us to advance our mission because through that legislative engagement, we can bring services and resources to our students. In relation to that, we also are constantly monitoring anything that might impinge upon the real independence of our schools. And that includes our religious liberty, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, and which we've had some challenges to of late. Through our engagement, we also advocate for school choice so that all families have access to a quality educational option for their child. And by doing that, we engage both in the legislative process with the General Assembly, but also with the regulatory process, which in most cases happens through the State Board of Education here in the state of Indiana, so that we can support things, again, that benefit our kids and oppose things that would maybe be harmful to our students. And then first and foremost, we engage because it provides a face and voice for the non-public school community. And that's because, as I alluded to, we have a lot at stake here in the state of Indiana. If we just look at our choice programs alone, you can see the voucher program and the growth of the voucher program on this side. I mean, when we started back in 2011, there were only 3,919 kids, which at that time made us the largest first-year program ever in terms of school choice. But we have now grown well over 36,000 students. The data in front of you is last year's data. But $162 million went to families to attend private schools. I'll talk a little bit later about messaging, but if you heard how I presented that, I didn't say $162 million came to private schools. $162 million went to families so that they could make the choice as to what was the best fit for their son and daughter. And that's just the voucher program. If you look at the tax credit program, there are another 10,000 students who have received tax credit scholarships. This is just in the past year here in the state of Indiana. So another $21.5 million went to families to help enable that choice. And it works, as you well know, the tax credit program works kind of hand in hand with the voucher program to enable choice. So we've got lots at stake here, lots of reasons why we should all be engaging in public policy. And if you've ever heard me speak on this topic, you know that I can get on my soapbox in terms of the importance of everybody owning their responsibility to engage in protecting these programs. You know, your families and your schools benefit from these programs, and the state Supreme Court says that indirectly your schools benefit from these programs. So whether we're talking about schools or individuals, we all have a stake in this, and it's critical that we all own some way our responsibility to protect these programs. You know, even once legislation is passed, I always say the battle never ends. There are always people trying to push back or to put things into these programs that would be harmful or make it difficult for our schools to participate. So we've got to have a unified, responsive, loud voice that can raise up when necessary, so our legislators hear the non-public school voice and can both protect the programs that we currently have in place and at times support additional legislation that could benefit our students as well. So it's got to be both a school priority and it's got to be a priority of all of our individual stakeholders. And we really have just two simple asks and when it comes to advocacy and people owning that responsibility. We ask everybody, as you're probably aware, to appoint a legislative liaison, and I'm hoping that a number of you on this webinar are legislative liaisons. Or I hope you know who the legislative liaison is in your school. And if you don't, and someone asked you to be a part of this webinar, they may be cultivating you to be the legislative liaison. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the role and the responsibilities of a liaison is. But they're basically our local grassroots coordinator, so that when we need to raise that voice, so that we need to reach out to our legislators, we have a structure built and in place to do that. We also ask each of our schools to set 2 public policy goals. That's just a very concrete way for schools to own that responsibility of engaging. And as I always say, it doesn't have to be rocket science. It doesn't have to be anything really complex. It's just somebody, whether that be the school administration, whether that be the school board or commission, whether that be the home school association, that they set goals so that you can, at your local level, and every non-public school here in the state, do something to engage in this public policy arena, because it is that important. You can do things like invite legislators into your building. You can help your families reach out to their elected representatives at select times, and we'll talk more about that. And we have a Legislative Action Center that hopefully makes that easy, and we'll talk more about that here shortly as well. You can also help us find families that are willing to tell their story about how either choice or non-public schools have benefited excuse me, have benefited their families or their children. You know, legislators hear a lot from people like me, a lobbyist. I'm at almost every education committee hearing and testify on any bill that may impact non-public schools. But they really listen a whole different way when it's coming from their constituents, when it's coming from a family that's technically not paid to be there. They're there, or they're reaching out, or they're writing because these particular pieces of legislation have a significant impact on their families. You can write letters to the editor or op-eds as well. So those are just some examples. You know, coming up at the end of January is National School Choice Week. You know, your school might host some kind of an event for National School Choice Week. Some of our groups around the state, one in particular in the Lafayette area, have hosted local rallies. Also up in the Fort Wayne area, they've done the same thing. And coming up next week on December 11th, the Lafayette group is hosting kind of a training session here in Indianapolis to share the process that they put together to help bring people together so that people understand the importance of engagement and help them to take steps to reach out to their elected representatives. You know, I reference those stories, and I tell folks all the time that one of the best advocacy tools is putting a face on the issue. You know, Heidi Harmon here, who works with us in communications and membership relations, one of the things that she is constantly working on is how to collect those stories, and how do we tell those stories via the media? How do we get those folks to, if need be, come to the State House and speak to legislators, or to reach out to their own elected representatives in their area? But there's nothing more powerful than hearing from a family, or hearing even from an older student about how choice or how about non-public schools have changed their lives. Heidi, I don't know if you want to add anything about the stories and some of the ones that are even currently now on our website.
Just really quick, you guys sending in stories to us, we don't want to make it too much work on you. All you really have to do, and a lot of principals or heads of school that do this, they'll just shoot me an email and tell me kind of just a very brief snippet of what this family story is, give me their name and their contact information, and I can take it from there. We'll do a story on our website. Several people, we've even worked with the media to get their story in local newspapers, or we might even bring them to the State House to testify if they're really comfortable with that. So all you have to do is just pass along their information, and then we can take it from there.
So those are some of the ways that, in concrete ways, that you can own that engagement responsibility. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the legislative liaison, because you may have heard that term. Hopefully your school, I think last time we checked, we had about 225 or so schools who have named legislative liaisons. We'd like to have one of those in every one of our schools. Excuse me. Many times it's a politically active or engaged parent. We try to take that responsibility off of the principal's plate, because we know the principal or the superintendent or head of school all have lots of kind of things that they need to do to ensure that their schools are providing that quality education. And a lot of times don't necessarily have the time, at least with the responsiveness that we need at times during the legislative session. So having someone who can do that legwork is very, very critical. So as I alluded to earlier, we need to have a grassroots infrastructure in place. And we need to have that now, so that when something comes up, or if there's a bill being heard that we think could be very positive or maybe be negative, we need to have that structure ready to go so that we can get people writing or emailing or calling their legislators to know how this could impact our non-public schools. So you can see here by the slide that, the grassroots infrastructure is key. We want to have that collective voice. We want to be able to mobilize our folks, because you can be sure that our opponents, people who may like to see legislation that's harmful to our schools, will have a very coordinated, loud voice, and it's important that we have some type of a counterbalance, so legislators hear, from the non-public school community as well. I had a superintendent ask me a couple years ago John, you keep talking about legislative liaisons, what would be technically the job description? And this is just kind of the paragraph job description that you would find. But basically it says that a liaison is a conduit between IMPEA's policy initiatives and your school community. That liaison works with your school administration to make sure parents and teachers and even your church community members are aware of legislation that could impact non-public schools, and they basically serve as a grassroots coordinator, so that at strategic times we can make sure that we have that voice ready. And if you've seen my presentation before, you've seen some of my wonderful clip art kind of slides that I put together that I consider myself a real PowerPoint whiz, and I'm saying that very tongue-in-cheek. But this is basically shows you kind of how things are supposed to operate. I always joke that that's me at the legislative session on the left. I have a little more hair than that, but not a whole lot. And I have the legislative liaison getting information from, our office, and that information being communicated to your school community. I do put the legislative liaison at a podium for a reason, because part of their responsibility, too, is to help educate your parent community about issues. It's not just to tell them, now you need to reach out. It's in kind of an ongoing way, make sure that they're aware of what the issues are, so that when it's time for people to engage, they do it in an informed fashion. It's not because they're puppets and we tell them to jump and they jump. It's because we've educated them that this is something that's very important. We need to be aware that somewhere down the road we may have to write or reach out or call or go visit our representatives to do so. I usually encourage schools that you allow your legislative liaison to possibly have like a little section in your, whether it's electronic newsletter or your paper newsletter that would go home, that can kind of serve as that, that educational component for families. At a homeschool association meeting or a parent-teacher meeting, whatever you call it, your particular school, you can, have something on the agenda where they can do a little legislative update for folks. Same thing could happen at a school board or a school commission meeting, that there's an agenda item where periodically the legislative liaison would come in and make sure folks are aware of what's happening at the State House, what are some current bills going on, and we provide that information to our legislative liaisons and to our school leaders through our IMPEA updates and our legislative alerts, which we can talk more about here in a little bit as well. legislative liaison can work with your school leadership to make sure you have those two goals set. And then finally, depending on, and most schools now communicate electronically with their school communities. Some still may use some folder type thing that goes home, but what is the communication strategy at your particular school, and how do you work with the school administration, school secretaries, or whoever to ensure that if we need to get information out to your school community so that they will respond, that, you know, what's the best vehicle for your school to do that. Again, some of my wonderful PowerPoint presentation clip art just kind of gives you a visual of the information coming out, going to your school community. But then the most important part on the other side is they have to respond. It's one thing for you to get the information out, but unless they reach out to their elected representatives, we're only carrying out half of the task. I always tell folks that, yes, I am at the State House on a regular basis, and I will be communicating to legislators, but in the political world, I am one person and I'm one vote. But if I can talk to the chair of the Senate Education Committee, as I did yesterday, and the issues that I point out to him are backed up by emails or phone calls, then they know that it's not just John Elcesser communicating these issues, that it's the non-public school community that find these things important. There's a variety of times during a legislative process where legislative liaisons, other stakeholders at your school community can engage in the process. One of the first things I always share with folks is to see if any of your local legislators are serving on any key committees at the State House. And two key committees would be the House Education Committee or the Senate Education Committee. And you can access that information online. Some of that information may be available through our Legislative Action Center. Otherwise, you can go to the Indiana General Assembly website under committees, and it'll tell you who's on that committee. And if it's somebody that's one of your own elected representatives from your area, you can have an even more significant voice because they listen to their own constituents even more than they would listen to, you know, just the general public. So the House and Senate Education Committees are two key committees. Other committees that are key would be the Senate Appropriations Committee, because they're involved in the budget process, and the House Ways and Means Committee, which is also involved in the budget process. Now, one thing to remember, and I should have mentioned this before, Indiana does a budget on a biennial basis, which means they do a budget every other year. This year is not a budget year, so it's a short session, and typically, and I'll mention this later, legislation that has a fiscal associated with it, there's a cost with this piece of legislation, most times doesn't have much chance of passing just because there is no budget being reviewed. The budget was done and it's a 2-year budget. So you can contact folks not only if you know the committee members, but during the committee hearing process, there is an opportunity for the public to engage. So if they're hearing a bill about improving the choice program, and it's going to be heard in front of the Senate Education Committee, as a part of that process, there is public comment. And like I said, there are lobbyist types like myself that will be there to testify, but it's also very, very helpful if school leaders or families who are directly impacted by the legislation are willing to come down to the State House to do that as well. And we help folks do that. We can help prep them in terms of the protocol and even what their particular comments might look like. In the legislative process, a bill is introduced, but that bill can look very different from the time it's introduced to when it's actually becomes law, and that happens through an amendment process. Bills can be amended through the committee process, or they could be amended on the floor of the House or Senate. And many times that's where people who are trying to do things to harm legislation do it through an amendment process. Last year during some particular bills on the House side, there were amendments posed that would have impacted the religious liberty of faith-based schools and their participation in the choice program. We're able to successfully fight those amendments off, but that's kind of an example of how important engaging in the amendment process is. After bills are amended, if they continue through from the committee process through the amending process, then they are voted on by the full House and the full Senate. That's another time when people can engage when they are voting on those bills. You can do that during the session, through email, through phone calls, through letters. You can come down to the State House and talk directly to your elected representatives, or many of those representatives hold what they call third house sessions, and sometimes they do it with a number of legislators in their area. They're kind of public forums. It's another opportunity for you to talk when you don't have to travel to the State House, and for those of you from around the state, you don't have to travel to Indianapolis to do that. And really, most importantly, we have a number of people on the webinar today, but to really have an impact, those numbers have to be significant. So we ask you, with the information that you take away today, that you encourage others to participate as well and share the information that we're sharing with you today. Just another point of information, we will share, Heidi will be sending out this PowerPoint to anybody who's participated, and we're also recording this as well. So people who weren't able to make it, and maybe some folks who would like to have participated, you can make them aware of that as well. I mentioned earlier that one way that we try to make it user-friendly for our constituents to participate in the process is through our Legislative Action Center, and that's something that's available through our IMPEA website, and Heidi is the one who really staffs that. You want to talk a little bit about how people can use that as a tool?
Sure. So a lot of times, one, if you just want to know a little bit more about your representative or your senator, you can go onto our Legislative Action Center, www.inpea.org, and then for advocates, and then Legislative Action Center, and then it'll bring you right there. And what you'll see is once you type in your zip code and address, it will give you your officials, and you can click on your officials and see what their contact information is, a little bit about them, what committees that they're on, so that you can know if you do live in an area where your representative is on an education committee, you can know that. Also, you can type any kind of message that you want to easily on our Legislative Action Center and send to your representative. But also what we'll do is if a really important bill comes up that we need people to specifically reach out to their representatives about, we will create a lot of times a template message just to kind of help you with some wording, and we'll send an alert out to everyone. So make sure that we have your information if you want to be on those alerts when we email those out. And then in those alerts, those emails that we send out, there will be a link for you to go directly to our Legislative Action Center and specifically email your representative about that specific bill or issue that we want you to contact them about. Right now, the only issue or campaign that we have on our Legislative Action Center is the Thank a Legislator one. So right now we're trying to get people to thank their legislator as we're getting ready to start our 2020 legislative session, just so they know that you're there, you're listening, you're active, you're thankful for them, so that they'll go into the session with a good feeling about our non-public school community, and that they know that you are passionate about those issues. Feel free to email me if you have any questions about that, but should be pretty self-explanatory.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of take a look back right now, talk about the last legislative session, and then we'll kind of talk about what we're anticipating coming up here in the session ahead. No, that's not George Clooney on there. That's yours truly, testifying at a Senate Education Committee hearing. And just to kind of give you a recap, last year we tracked about 87 different pieces of legislation, different bills. We have a computer program where we can follow that legislation, track it through the process, and it alerts us when the bills are going to be heard, who the authors are, if there's any kind of amendments coming up. Some of those 87 bills may have dealt more with the public sector, with public schools, but we wanted to watch those bills just in case they inserted something into that bill dealing with non-public schools. There were about 25 bills that we actively engaged with. And that means by actively engaged, we either lobbied legislators on them, on aspects of that bill. I testified, or we brought people in to testify at particular committee hearings, or we got our grassroots folks to engage in writing their legislative representatives. I think last year we had about 170 different people who, when we were looking at the Senate budget bill that had choice improvements in it, that wrote their legislators through email. That's the easiest way for us to track, although sometimes folks will make phone calls or they'll write letters, which we're not aware of. So there may have been a lot more response to that particular Senate budget bill. But we are able to track that too, so we know, which legislators were contacted and, how many contacts they had, who reached out to them. Overall, we felt like we were pretty successful coming out of the last session. Did we do everything we wanted to do? By no means. I alluded to earlier that we had a number of what I would call attacks on our school's religious liberty. And if you're aware and you've been following things in the media, you're probably aware that there has been a real push to say that faith-based schools cannot hire folks that are in line with their faith beliefs and values. And we believe that that's not the case, that faith-based schools should have that constitutional right to operate out of their beliefs and values. And so there was a bill introduced that would have impacted the hiring practices of faith-based choice schools. That bill never got a hearing. There were a number of amendments put on or attempted to be put on legislation that would have done the same thing. Those amendments were successfully defeated. So we felt good in terms of the protection of our religious liberties for our schools, but that is something that we believe will continue to be a concern, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The other good news, we did score some improvements to the state's school choice programs. We added a third 70% voucher tier, and I've heard some preliminary feedback from school leaders that has been a real positive in some of their schools in terms of providing families with additional support to be able to make a choice. We also added a second voucher application window. As you're aware, in the past, anybody who wanted to come into our schools after September 1st would not be eligible until the following year, but that second voucher window was added so that people could apply from November through January, I think 15th, I can't remember the exact date, so that we had people transferring in late or moving into the area, they still had the opportunity to apply for a choice scholarship or for a voucher. And then also the scholarship tax credit program, most people refer to as SGO related, we were able to increase the tax credit cap because there's only so much credits available each year, and we were able to increase that both in this year, this school year, and again an increase in the second school year. Also, some improvements to school safety initiatives and non-public schools access to that, as well as school safety grants. There was additional funding made available. That was something that we lobbied heavily for in the budget before this past budget, and were able to get grant access to our non-public schools. Historically, it had only been available to publics and to charters. And last year, or the year before last, I think $1.6 million went out and secured school grants. This year, it topped $2 million. So a lot of our schools have been able to make their schools safer based on that legislative activity. And I'm sure that a number of our schools engaged when we were asking. There were alerts sent out on that particular piece of legislation a few years back. So that's kind of a recap of where we've been. Now, as we look to 2020, important to remember that this is not a budget year. So any kind of legislation, and most what I would call meaty legislation, has a cost. So any legislation that has a cost, very minimal chance that it would be considered in this coming 2020 session. So our first priority, and this is always our priority, but especially in non-budget years, is to protect and defend. We want to make sure that we protect our choice programs, we protect our religious liberty, we protect other programs like school safety and formative assessment grants and those kind of things that somebody could try to tweak or cause some problems with. We always want to be vigilant and monitor all of that, and that's probably, you know, one of our main priorities, and one of the ones that we want to alert our folks to make sure that you realize the importance of engaging on that. So we'll be predominantly in a defensive posture this session. The other thing that we do want to do is we want to try to get the freeway accreditation process, which revised. For those of you that are freeway accredited, you know that the performance standards are unachievable. They were written back 23 years ago, so we tried to revise that last legislative session, but because of a disagreement between two legislators over cursive writing, that particular bill died, and we're hoping that we'll resurrect that bill and come up with a way that we can get it through the process without getting bogged down by disagreements between a couple legislators. I had the opportunity yesterday to meet with Senator Jeff Rotz, who's the chairman of the Senate Education Committee, and he certainly understands that, and I think he's going to be very willing to help us to make sure that however we, whether we do a standalone bill or we insert that into another piece of legislation, that we're able to get that through the process this year. I've got a meeting coming up next week with the head of the House Education Committee, and hopefully we can get his support on that as well. The other thing we're going to be supporting and be looking at is the I Learn Hold Harmless. If you have been around a while, a number of years ago, we had, on another change in the state assessment, we had a hold harmless clause built into legislation. But there were a few schools, because of the way the language was written, that were left out of that. And what we're communicating to folks is we're going to hold harmless. We need to hold every school harmless, and they're not penalized during this transition period to a new assessment. And that's something that public school folks are in support of as well. Always going to be looking at pushing back on additional kinds of regulation as well in terms of that whole protect and defend area. Now, in the choice area, something that is on our radar, and whether or not it ends up being something we address legislatively or we address administratively, we're still kind of working on that. But most schools that are choice schools on the call received information from the department about their 3 strikes new policy, and we have some concerns with how that's structured, and we've communicated those to the department and are determining whether or not we need to come up with legislation to address that, or whether we need to work through the administrative channels. There's another issue that we're working with on the choice office, and it deals with fees that are voucher eligible. The department has kind of made an interpretation on their own that any fee they see as optional is not voucher eligible. So as an example, if a student had the option of a general music or instrumental music, and the instrumental music had a fee, the instrumental music fee would not be eligible. I've never thought that made any sense, because the state's making decisions for kids in terms of what things they want to pursue. And now, even in light of this changing philosophy around graduation pathways, which really promotes options, it even makes less sense. So that's something that we're looking at too, in terms of which way to address. I've communicated it with Senator Rotz yesterday. I will with Representative Baining also. And there seems to be a growing administrative burden coming out of how the choice program is monitored. So that's another area that we have some concern about that we're watching. And I doubt that we'll be able to address these in a non-budget year. We tried to get the sibling fix taken care of in the last legislative session, but they chose to take on what they considered bigger priorities, like the voucher, 70% voucher tier in the second voucher application window. But for those of you that may not be familiar with those issues, the sibling pathway requires a family to be at 150% of free and reduced lunch. But there are some families that are voucher eligible that are now at a 200% of free and reduced lunch. Either they originally were 150% eligible and then they were in the continuous pathway, or they came in via the special ed pathway, which allows 200%. So a particular family may have older children that are eligible, but a sibling coming in would not be eligible, and that just doesn't make sense. I think it's counterintuitive in terms of when the sibling pathway was adopted. The other area deals with the foster children, and currently foster children are automatically they meet financial eligibility, but they may not have a track that fits. And so if the intent was to make foster children eligible for the program, they need to both address the financial eligibility, which is addressed, and that there's a pathway or a track that would make foster children eligible. If there's other areas that you believe that we should be thinking about, we sent out a survey months ago when we were putting together our legislative agenda and had a number of folks respond to that. But if there are other issues, especially issues that you don't believe would have a budget impact, and feel free to email me, or you can, through the chat function, use that to let us know about that right now. And I think we have a couple chat questions right now that Heidi's gonna.
The first question, can you provide any additional details on the 3 strikes rule that the choice office is pushing? Are schools allowed to make mistakes, or is it essentially 3 strikes, you're out?
Very good question. And as I understand, we had a very robust conversation about this a couple weeks ago, and the 3 strikes, as I understand, have to occur in multiple years. So you could using your language, you could make 3 mistakes in 1 year, but it only counts as 1 strike. The thing that we have been pushing back on is that a data entry error and somebody fraudulently trying to administer the program are very different in terms of severity, and there doesn't seem to be clear understanding of the severity that merits a strike. And so that's something that we're pushing back on. I think in some of the guidance that's come out from the department, and I don't have that in front of me right now, Brad has attempted to provide some clarity, but to me there are still things that I think are just error-based, that if somebody makes a mistake, I don't know that should have the same weight as something that's more significant. And so we're continuing. That's something I had a conversation with Senator Rotz about yesterday, because it doesn't make sense. And the other part of it that we really pushed back strongly on is the retroactive aspect of it. I told them, and I told their attorneys, I've never seen a policy implemented that was retroactively, people were held accountable. Policies typically are moving forward. So they heard some of that. We'll see what comes of it. My approach typically is try to work through those administrative channels first, and if not, if we're not heard or something, there's not movement or understanding, then we try legislative channels, because that they have to abide by the legislative boundaries that they were given.
And one more question. Can you comment on possible changes to the career externship rules added to teacher licensing renewal?
Good questions, folks. I think what they're referring to is of the 90 PGP points that are required to use that option for your licensure renewal in the last legislative session, they carved out 15 of those for career awareness kinds of opportunities. And if you saw all the stuff that went on with the Red for Ed Day, and that's a whole other conversation that we won't necessarily get into today, but that was one of their priorities, is the repeal of that 15-hour requirement. It is not limited to an externship, just so folks know. There are professional development kinds of opportunities. You can have an employer come in and, we kind of joked when I was going out doing some preliminary meetings with principals. One of the local breweries in town set up a kind of a training thing on, career areas and that. And so there's a PD part of it. And my read is that the Department of Ed, his interpretation of that is much more flexible in terms of what's acceptable. But I think a lot of folks took away the externship and thought that was the only option to take care of that particular requirement, and it's not. You can get hours in professional development kinds of opportunities Chamber of Commerce can do or local employers can do, even things sometimes that we offer at MPAC or MPEC that might be related to the whole career awareness thing could count as well, because it's supposed to be done in partnership with some business, higher ed opportunity, or some community partner, and IMPEA in some ways can serve as that community partner. In my conversation with Senator Rotz today, or yesterday, and this is just his opinion, there's a lot of process that has to happen. He said he doesn't believe that he's going to be in support of repealing it, but he would be in support of revising it, and even to the point of making it optional. Now, whether or not that occurs, that's just what his preliminary read was, and that's one person's opinion out of a 200-person General Assembly. That is. No other questions. All right, I'm going to move on to this last section, and we're getting close to, I wanted to try to keep this pretty close to an hour. We've talked about what's happening and the important issues. The last thing we want to talk briefly about is how do we talk about these issues. Messaging can be critical, whether that's talking to your friend, or whether that's talking to your staff, or whether that's talking to your board, or whether that's talking to the media, or it's talking to legislators. It can be almost as important as what we do is how we talk about it. IMPEA, from the beginning really with choice, has really tried to be supportive in providing messaging kinds of tools for folks. How do we talk about these things? Because sometimes when we talk about them and we do it in a way that is contrary to really the way or the reason legislation was put into place, the media picks up on that, or someone else picks up on it. It may be very unintentional, but it can be very damaging. So first of all, when we talk about choice, and you've probably heard, if you've heard me speak, talk about some of these things. When we talk about the benefits of school choice, we don't talk about the benefits to our schools. We talk about the impact on families and students. These programs were not designed to benefit non-public schools or to help promulgate faith or to evangelize. They were put in place to give families the opportunity to choose schools that are the best fit for them. So when we talk about benefit, we talk about benefit to families and kids. I always, there used to be a lot of conversation about, we want to get kids out of bad schools and in good schools, and how you define bad and good schools to me is, it can be very debatable. I always talk about fit. And you may have a child in an exemplary school, but it's not the right fit for them, and they're not being successful, so they need to have choices and options too. So when I talk about the benefit of choice, I talk about finding the right fit for that child and for their family. And then finally, and this is very important, you'll hear our opponents talking about, well, you take public dollars, you need to do the same thing public schools do, everything that public school needs to do. and there's a very important nuance, and I said this to Senator Rotz yesterday, and he hadn't really heard it in that way, and matter of fact, wrote it down and asked me to send the information. But I always say that if we are not publicly funded private schools. We are private schools who accept some publicly funded students. And some of those publicly funded students aren't fully funded either. Many of them are. And it's really no different than Notre Dame or Taylor or Anderson or Indiana Wesleyan taking kids who are 21st century scholars. They're publicly funded kids going to a private institution. So no difference. Small nuance, but very, very important. So as I alluded to earlier, there were $162 million that went to families to choose their private school. Not $162 million went to private schools. So important kind of just little nuances of how we talk about school choice. And then the other area, which has grown to be very, very significant for us, is dealing with religious liberty, and in particular around hiring around same-sex marriage and hiring and employment practices around LGBTQ-related issues. And no matter where you stand on those issues, you know, the bottom line is that a faith-based school should be able to operate in alignment with their values and their beliefs. And so that's our main point. And as I said earlier, we were successful, but you can see some of the messaging points here. You know, we put specific language into the voucher legislation thanks to Senator Scott Snyder, who's no longer at the State House, but was the chair of the board at Heritage Christian, that guards against the government's overreach, especially as it relates to our curriculum, instruction, and our teachers' hiring. And this is language pulled specifically out of the voucher law. Indiana's commitment to parental choice is centered in a belief that parents, not the government, are the best position to make the educational choices for their children. We believe that that's the parent's role, not the government, or not dictated by zip code, but parents know what value system they want their children to be a part of. They know what educational needs, where their children will thrive, and so they should be making those important choices. You know, the success of choice is providing lots of different options for families. Not trying to make all schools look alike or be alike. It's trying to have diversity out there so that every child will find that school where the light bulb goes on and they thrive. So we want diversity, and whether that's in public schools, non-public schools, charter schools, virtual schools, home schools, whatever fits for that child where they're going to be successful, that's what's best for that child. We believe that the ability to operate out of our religious beliefs is a constitutional right. And as I alluded to earlier, the Indiana Supreme Court, specifically in the language, in their ruling, when they said that our choice program was constitutional by the Indiana State Constitution, and they voted 5-0 that said it was constitutional. And excuse me. Because they said that families are the direct beneficiaries of these programs, not schools. Schools are indirect beneficiaries. So those messaging points, I don't know, Heidi, if you want to add anything in that particular area, but really important, not only what we do, but how we talk about it. And even with all of that said, it's critical that we engage as many people, as many of our stakeholders as possible, in being a voice to protect these programs and to grow these programs. And as I said earlier, you know, we've got, you know, 50 or some folks on this call. We need that number to multiply, you know, and part of your charge going forward is to share this information and share the importance of everybody engaging and owning that engagement. So as as we come to close to our hour here in closure, you know, my question always is, what will each of you on this call do? What will you do to protect that young lady and her opportunities that's on that screen to attend a school where she's going to thrive and be successful. What's your school going to do? And I encourage you, if you're a school leader, make sure you got your liaison, make sure your goals set. Your goals are set. If you're a stakeholder, a parent, a staff member, then talk to your administrator and find out, who's our liaison, what can I do to help, what are our goals this year, how can we work with John to make sure that this is another successful session for non-public schools here in the state of Indiana. So with that said, any questions, and don't hang up yet or leave, I've got one more slide I want to share with you. Anybody have any other chat questions? And I'm going to give you my contact information here in a second, so feel free to email me. Most importantly, I look forward to working with you during this legislative session. And before we leave, the other arm that we didn't talk about today is our conferences. And we've got the date set for Impact 2020. It's November 5th and 6th, and please put that on your school calendar as you plan your calendar for next year. We'd like to see you there both days. Many schools bring their entire faculties. They use Title IIA dollars to do that. We're very happy to announce our keynote speakers, John Gordon, who's, I'm told, like the second most sought after keynote speaker around the country, and speaks not only at education entities, but for Southwest Airlines and all these major corporations bring him in as well. He's written many, many books, but one's called The Energy Bus, if you've heard of that, and we're really excited. He's giving us a monumental discount to come and speak. Jerry Brooks is from Louisville, Kentucky, and is a principal there, and many of our folks have asked to bring him in as a speaker. He has a huge social media following. He does kind of comedic podcast and YouTube videos about school leaders and education issues. So we have Jerry Brooks going to be there on Friday. Really encourage you, and there'll be lots of other great programming. So we hope to see, we want to break records this year. We had over 2,000 people at the last Impact, and we want to smash those records this year. So here's our contact information. Mine's there. Heidi's is there. If you have the stories that you can help, identify families that are willing to tell their stories, please email Heidi, and she'd be happy to reach out to them. If you have questions, reach out to me. But remember, when we all do our part, we are stronger together. So thanks for being a part of the call. Looking forward to working with you in the 2020 session. God bless everybody. Take care.